My parents started telling me I was the plain one when I was 7 years old. Not those words exactly. They were careful about words the way people are careful about things they want to say without being caught saying them. What they said was, "Your sister has your mother's cheekbones, and Camille photographs so beautifully, doesn't she? And you have such a wonderful personality, Lottie," which is the sentence adults use when they have run out of complimentary things to say about a child's appearance and need to land somewhere. By the time I was 12, I had absorbed it fully, not as cruelty, as fact, the way children absorb the facts their households offer them about who they are. Camille was the pretty one. I was the one with the personality. I carried this for 21 years, through middle school and high school and a college where I kept my head down, and a career where I put everything I had into being competent because competent was the lane available to me, until the night of my sister's wedding rehearsal dinner when my father stood up with a champagne flute and gave a toast that cost him $85,000 and my entire understanding of my own face. He talked about Camille for 4 minutes, her beauty, her grace, the way a room changed when she walked into it. He talked about her husband Marcus for 2 minutes. He talked about the wedding budget, $85,000, which my parents had contributed without hesitation, without condition, without any of the conversations about whether this was practical or manageable that I had watched them have about every other major expenditure of my lifetime. He raised his glass. He said, "To the most beautiful thing our family has ever produced." He meant Camille. Everyone in the room understood. He meant Camille. I was seated at the third table. I had a glass of champagne. I did not drink. And across from me, watching my face with the specific attention of a woman who had been watching my face for 6 years and knew every register it had, was my fiancée Dara, who set down her own glass and said quietly, "Are you okay?" I said, yes. I was lying. What I was not prepared for was what happened the following evening, at the wedding itself, when the person who stood up to speak was not my father and not my mother and not anyone who had been invited to speak at all. And what they said rearranged every fact I thought I knew about my family, my face, and the $85,000 that had always been about something other than a wedding. Before I take you back to the beginning, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story genuinely stays with you. Drop your city and the time in the comments. I always love knowing where you're watching from. My name is Lottie Grayson. I'm 31 years old. I am an occupational therapist in Asheville, North Carolina, which means I spend my working life helping people rediscover what their bodies and minds can do after injury or illness or the slow accumulation of a life lived in ways that were not quite right for them. I am good at this work. I am good at it because I understand, in ways I did not fully understand until a wedding weekend in May, what it costs to have spent years living inside someone else's story about who you are. This is the story of the plain one, the pretty one, the $85,000, and the speech that was never supposed to happen. Let me take you back to Brevard, North Carolina, a small town in Transylvania County at the edge of the Pisgah National Forest, the kind of place where the waterfalls are named and the roads curve into the mountains, and the people who grew up there either leave as soon as they can or decide the leaving isn't worth what you trade for it. My family was the staying kind. My father, Edmund Grayson, had run an insurance brokerage in Brevard for 27 years. My mother, Patricia, had been a bookkeeper for a dental practice for 19 years. We were not wealthy. We were stable, the specific stability of two people who had made conservative decisions for decades and arrived at a comfortable middle age with a paid-off house and a small investment account, and the particular pride of people who had built what they built without help. Camille was 4 years older than me. She had my mother's coloring, dark hair, olive skin, the kind of face that photographed well in natural light. She was aware of this in the comfortable way of people who receive consistent evidence of something and have stopped having to think about it. She was not unkind to me. She was the kind of older sister who is generous from a position of security, which is a different thing from the kind, who is generous from understanding. She knew she was the pretty one the way she knew she was older, as an ambient fact of the world. She had never had to choose it. I had my father's coloring, light, unremarkable in the specific register of things that are fine but do not call attention to themselves. I had my father's nose, which was larger than my mother's nose, and my father's eyebrows, which were heavier than my mother's eyebrows, and a combination of features that, assembled, produced a face that was interesting rather than beautiful in the specific way that the word interesting is used when beautiful is unavailable. I knew this the way I knew my shoe size, as a practical fact about a body I inhabited and worked around. What I did not know, until I was 25 and met Dara Chun in the graduate social work program at Western Carolina University, was that the face I had been working around was not the face Dara saw when she looked at me. Dara was studying social work. I was finishing my master's in occupational therapy. We were in the same seminar on community-based care, adjacent desks, and she had turned to me after a class discussion about patient self-perception and said, "You make a very convincing argument. Also, you have remarkable bone structure." I had looked at her for a moment and said, "I think you have the wrong person." She said, "I genuinely don't." She said it the way she said everything, without decoration, without apology, as a simple statement of what she observed. It was the first time in 25 years that someone had looked at my face and described it as something to notice rather than something to accommodate. We dated for 2 years and moved in together at 27 and got engaged at 29 when Dara proposed in our kitchen on a Tuesday evening after dinner, with a ring she had chosen with the specific intentionality she brought to everything she chose, and said, "You are the most interesting person I have ever looked at, and I would like to keep looking at you for the rest of my life." I said yes before she finished the sentence. We planned a wedding for 18 months. Modest by any standard, 60 guests, a venue in the mountains outside Asheville that we chose because of the light, a caterer we found through a friend's recommendation, flowers from a local farm that Dara had scouted over 3 weekends. Total budget, $22,000, which we funded ourselves, divided between our savings, because we had agreed from the beginning that funding the wedding ourselves meant the wedding was ours. My parents contributed nothing to our wedding. Not because they were asked and declined, because they were not asked, because I had understood from the shape of our family's financial history that the money my parents had was organized around Camille's trajectory, and had always been, and I did not want the complication of a contribution that came with the weight of what contributing to Lottie's wedding would mean in their accounting of themselves. My sister's wedding was planned for the May before our own. The $85,000 figure I knew because my mother told me, not as a boast, as a confidence, woman to woman, the kind of number shared between people who trust each other. She called me in January and said, "I need to tell you what we're doing for Camille's wedding, because I want you to hear it from me before you hear it somewhere else." She said, "We're contributing $85,000. I said, "Mom." She said, "I know." She said, "We've been saving for this since Camille was in high school. Your father wanted to give her the wedding she deserved." I said, "Okay." She said, "Lottie, we want to give you something too. For your wedding. We have been talking about it, and we want to contribute." I said, "Mom, it's okay." She said, "We want to give you." I said, "We've planned everything. It's taken care of." She said, "We want to contribute something." I said, "I know, and I love you, but it's handled." She said, "Are you sure?" I said, "Yes." I got off the phone, and I sat in my kitchen, and I did the math that I had been doing for 24 years in one form or another. What Camille's version of things cost, and what mine cost, and what the difference said about what my parents believed about what each of us deserved. The math was $85,000 versus 0, and it said the thing it always said. I did not tell Dara about the call for 3 days. When I told her, she was quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of someone who is deciding whether to say what they are thinking. And then she said, "What did they offer you?" I said, "Something." She said, "How much?" I said, "They didn't say." She said, "Why didn't you let them say?" I looked at her. She said, "Lottie, you didn't let them say because you were afraid the number would be small." She said, "And a small number would have confirmed something that a no number doesn't quite confirm." I said, "Yes." She said, "I understand that." She said, "I also think you deserve to let them say it and find out." I said, "Maybe." I said, "It doesn't matter now." She said, "Okay." She said, "I need to tell you something." I said, "What?" She said, "I love your face." She said, "I have loved it since the seminar. I want you to hear that." I said, "I know." She said, "I don't think you do. Not completely. But I'm going to keep saying it until you do." The rehearsal dinner was on a Friday evening at a restaurant in Asheville that Camille had chosen because it had a private room and a prix-fixe menu and the specific aesthetic she had been building her wedding around. Refined Southern, warm but intentional, the kind of occasion my parents understood as the right scale for a Grayson event. 60 people at the rehearsal dinner. My parents at the head table with Camille and Marcus and his family. Dara and I at the third table with some of Camille's college friends I half knew and a couple I didn't know at all. My father stood up at 8:14 p.m. He clinked his glass. He had the posture of a man who has prepared a speech and is pleased with it, the specific upright quality of prepared pleasure. He talked about Camille. I will not repeat the full 4 minutes because it belongs to the occasion it was meant for, and I have no interest in diminishing my sister's wedding. What I will say is that it was the toast my father had been building toward for 31 years. All the photographs so beautifully, and your mother's cheekbones, and the most beautiful thing our family has ever produced delivered finally in full, in public, in a room with 60 people and a prix-fixe menu and an $85,000 accounting behind it. He did not mention me. Dara and I were in the room. He did not mention us. He raised his glass. He said, "To the most beautiful thing our family has ever produced." He sat down. The room drank. I held my glass and did not drink and felt Dara's hand find mine under the table and hold it. She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "Yes." She held my hand tighter, which was how she told me she knew I was lying without making me defend the lie. The wedding was on Saturday at 4 p.m. at a venue in the mountains outside of Brevard, the kind of venue that existed because Brevard was the kind of town where people came to get married in the mountains, and the venues had adjusted accordingly. White tent, fairy lights, ceremony on a lawn with the forest behind it, and the late afternoon light coming through the trees in the specific gold of a Transylvania County May afternoon. It was genuinely beautiful. I say this without complication. My sister's wedding was genuinely beautiful, and I was glad to be there, and I loved her. We were seated at dinner, the toasts finished, the first dance done, the specific loosening of a reception that has moved past its formal requirements into something more natural. The band was setting up for the first dance set. The caterers were clearing the salad course. And then a chair scraped back at the table nearest the edge of the tent, and a woman stood up without being asked, and she was 73 years old, and she was holding a water glass rather than a champagne flute because she did not drink, and she was my father's aunt, Great-Aunt Roslyn Grayson, who had driven from Hendersonville alone in her 2009 Buick, and who I had not seen in 4 years, and who had in my childhood been the one adult in my family who looked at me like I was specifically interesting rather than generically loved. Roslyn said, "I am going to say something that nobody has asked me to say, and that several people in this room will not be pleased about. I want to say it anyway because I am 73 years old, and I have been waiting to say it for 20 years, and a wedding seems like the right occasion." She looked at my father. She said, "Edmund, Do you know why you've been calling Lottie the plain one since she was 7 years old? My father's face went the color of something that has been caught in a light it wasn't expecting. She said, because she looks exactly like your mother. She said, your mother, Edmund, who you spent your entire childhood being told was not as pretty as your father's women. Your mother, who you watched your father dismiss for 30 years because she had the grace and bone structure and not the beauty your father preferred. She said, Lottie has your mother's face, and you have been so conditioned by 30 years of watching your father treat that face as less than that you have been doing it to your own daughter without understanding that's what you were doing. The tent was completely silent. She said, I watched you do it for 20 years, and I should have said something long ago, and I didn't, and that is my failure. She said, I am saying it now. She turned and looked at me directly across the room. She said, Lottie, you have your grandmother Helen's face. Helen was the most beautiful woman I ever knew, and she spent her whole life being told otherwise by people who were wrong. You look exactly like her. She said, I want you to know that. I want you to know it specifically and on the record, at a wedding, in front of 63 people. She raised her water glass. She said, to Helen Grayson, who deserved better. She drank. She sat down. Nobody moved for approximately 6 seconds. Then Dara, beside me, raised her champagne glass and said, to Helen. She said it clearly into the silence without hesitation. I said, to Helen. My voice was not steady. I did not care. From the far end of the room, one of Marcus's uncles, who had no idea who Helen Grayson was or what had just happened, said, to Helen. He raised his glass. 6 other people followed, filling the silence the way people fill silences at weddings when they are not entirely sure what is happening, but can feel that something important is. My father was looking at the table. My mother was looking at Roslyn. Roslyn was eating her salad. Let me pause here because I need you to sit with something before I go on. If an elderly relative stood up at a family wedding and said the thing that explained 20 years of something you had never been able to name, would you have been grateful in the moment, or would the grief have arrived before the gratitude? Because both came for me at that table in that order, and they arrived so close together that they were almost the same feeling. And I want to know if you have felt that. Tell me in the comments. What happened in the 20 minutes after Roslyn's speech happened in the way important things happen at weddings, in pieces between other things in the margins of a celebration that was going to continue regardless. The band started. People danced. The cake was cut. My father did not come to me. My mother did, briefly. She put her hand on my arm and looked at me with an expression I did not have a name for, and said, I should have said something to you a long time ago. I said, I know. She said, I didn't know about Helen. I mean, I knew your grandmother, but I didn't understand what Edmund had been told about her. She said, I didn't understand why he did it with you. She said, I understand now. I said, okay. She said, I'm sorry. I said, I know. She went back to the head table. Dara put her arm around me. I let her. Roslyn found me at 9 p.m. near the dessert table. She was eating a piece of wedding cake with the satisfaction of someone who has completed a task and is ready to enjoy what follows. She said, I've been wanting to say that since you were 11. I said, why 11? She said, because you were 11 and you came to Thanksgiving and you had cut your hair. Do you remember? Short, because you said you wanted to try it. And your father looked at you and said, well, it's a look. She said, and I watched your face. And I thought, someone is going to spend their life believing she is not beautiful, and she is wrong, and it is her father's fault. She said, I should have said it then. I said, you said it now. She said, 20 years late. I said, better than not. She said, yes. She said, Lottie, I have a photograph of your grandmother, Helen. She opened the small bag she carried and produced a photograph, the kind that has been kept in a wallet for a long time, worn at the edges, slightly faded, the specific warmth of a photo taken in the 1960s. A woman, early 30s, standing in front of a house that was not the house I knew. The woman had my nose, my eyebrows, my jaw, and the set of my eyes, and the line of my cheekbones, which I had spent 31 years thinking of as interesting rather than beautiful. She looked at the camera with an expression that was not performing anything. She just looked at the camera, the way someone looks at a camera when they are entirely comfortable being looked at. I said, "That's me." I said it without thinking, which was the truest thing I had ever said about my own face. Roslyn said, "That's Helen." She said, "I'm giving you the photograph." I said, "This is your photograph." She said, "It always belonged to you. I was just keeping it until the right moment." I took it. I held it for a long time. Dara came and stood beside me and looked at it and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "There you are." She said it quietly, to the photograph and to me simultaneously. "There you are." I want to tell you about the conversation with my father, because it happened, and it is the part of this story that required the most from both of us. He called me on Monday, 2 days after the wedding, after Dara and I had driven back to Asheville, and I had sat with what had happened for 48 hours and let it settle into the shape it was going to settle into rather than the shape I wanted it to have. He said, "Roslyn told me she was going to do that." I said, "When did she tell you?" He said, "About 20 minutes before she did it. She found me near the bar and said, 'Edmund, I'm going to say something tonight that you are not going to like, and I want you to know so it's not a complete shock.'" He said, "I told her not to." He said, "She did it anyway." I said, "Yes." He said, "Lottie." I said, "Yes." He said, "She was right." He said it plainly, not with the performance of a man being generous, with the specific flatness of a man who has spent 2 days looking at something he had been turning away from for 30 years and has finally decided to look at it straight. He said, "My mother, your grandmother, Helen. My father spent 30 years treating her as if she were less than what she was. He had a specific idea of what a beautiful woman looked like, and Helen didn't fit it, and he made sure she knew that for 30 years. He said, "I grew up inside that. I absorbed it the way you absorb the facts your household offers you. And I did it to you without understanding I was doing it, because your face is her face, and I had been trained to see her face as the less than version." He stopped. He said, "That is not an excuse. I need to be clear about that. I'm telling you the reason, not justifying it." He said, "There is no justification for making your daughter believe she is plain for 24 years. He said, "I am sorry, Lottie." He said, "That doesn't cover it. I know it doesn't cover it." He said, "Tell me what you need." I said, "I need to ask you something first." He said, "Okay." I said, "The $85,000. He said, "Yes." I said, "It was always about Camille." He said, "Yes." I said, "It was never going to be the same for me." He was quiet. I said, "Not because you love me less, because you had already decided what Camille deserved and what I deserved, and the money reflected those decisions." He said, "Yes." He said, "I know that's true." He said, "I also know the offer your mother made you, the contribution for your wedding. I don't know what number she had in mind. I should know. I don't." He said, "What did she offer?" I said, "She didn't get to say. I stopped her." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because I was afraid the number would confirm something." He said, "I understand that." He said, "I want you to know what the number was going to be." He said, "It was going to be $25,000. I said nothing. He said, I know, that's not $85,000. He said, it was not equal. I want to say that, clearly. It was not equal, and I can give you every rationalization. You had said you didn't want help, you had more modest plans, but the truth is the number was lower because of a thing I believed about you that was wrong. He said, I'm sorry. He said, is there anything I can do? I said, give me some time. He said, okay. He said, I'm going to write you a letter. When I've had enough time to find the right words. I said, okay. He said, Lottie. I said, yes. He said, you have your grandmother's face. He said, I know that sounds empty coming from me right now. He said, I'm saying it anyway because I have been saying the wrong thing for 30 years, and saying the right thing is where I have to start. I said, okay, Dad. I said, start there. Let me tell you where everyone is now. Dara and I were married in September. Our wedding, 60 people, mountain venue, local farm flowers, the specific light of a September afternoon in the Blue Ridge that is different from May light, sharper, bluer, the mountains clear all the way to their ridges. I wore a dress I had chosen because Dara had said, when I tried it on, that one, that's the one. I believed her. I looked at myself in the mirror in the dressing room, and I looked at my grandmother Helen's photograph, which I had brought with me, and I thought, there you are. I wore my face to my wedding as if it belonged to me. It does. My father gave a toast. He had asked in advance if he could, and I had said yes with the specific conditions I had stated. He would speak to who I was, not to what I looked like in either direction. He honored the condition. He talked about the kind of care I brought to my work. He talked about the Saturday morning when I was 8 and I had reorganized every spice cabinet in the house into alphabetical order because the disorder bothered me, which was the first evidence anyone in the family had that I was going to be someone who cared deeply about systems and function. He talked about the specific way I loved, quietly, thoroughly, the way I did everything. He said, my daughter chose a partner who sees her exactly as she is. That is the best evidence I have that she is wiser than I gave her credit for being. He raised his glass. He said, to Lottie and Dara. He sat down. It was not a perfect speech. It was a better speech than the rehearsal dinner. It was the speech of a man who had been corrected and had tried. I gave him credit for the trying. My mother sent us a check after the wedding, $25,000. The envelope came with a card in her handwriting that said, I should have made sure this got to you sooner. I love you, Mom. I deposited the check. I kept the card. I have it in the drawer with the photograph of Helen. Roslyn Grayson came to our wedding. She drove the 2009 Buick from Hendersonville, and she sat in the second row, and she cried during the ceremony, which was the only time I had ever seen Roslyn cry. And she gave us a framed print she had made of Helen's photograph, not the wallet-sized one, an 8x10 professionally scanned and printed in a frame she had chosen with the specific taste of someone who understands what a photograph is for. It hangs in our living room in Asheville, now, to the left of the window that gets the afternoon light. Helen looks out at the room with the expression of someone who is entirely comfortable being looked at. I look at it every morning. Camille called me 2 weeks after her honeymoon. She said, I need to talk to you about Roslyn's speech. I said, okay. She said, I didn't know. I said, which part? She said, any of it. I didn't know about Grandma Helen. I didn't know that's why Dad said the things he said about you. She said, I want you to know that I always thought you were beautiful. I thought that was obvious. I didn't know it wasn't. I said, it wasn't obvious to me. She said, I know. I'm sorry. She said, I've been thinking about the $85,000. I said, Camille, you don't need to. She said, I want to. She said, I've been thinking about it since Roslyn spoke. I have been the pretty one my whole life, and I didn't examine what that meant for you. I accepted it. She said, that was selfish in a way I didn't understand until Saturday night. I said, Camille, you were a child, and then you were an adult who was given something. That's not the same as taking it. She said, I know. She said, I still want to say it. I said, okay. She said, I'm saying it. She said, I love your face, Lottie. I have always loved your face. I just never thought to say it because nobody in our family said that kind of thing to you. I said, no, they didn't. I said, thank you for saying it now. She said, I'm going to keep saying it. I said, I know. I said, Camille. She said, yes. I said, your wedding was beautiful. She said, I know. She said, so was yours. I said, I know. Roslyn and I talk on the phone every Sunday. We started the Sunday calls after the wedding because I called her to thank her, and she said, call me every Sunday. I am 73, and I have no interest in being thanked. I have interest in knowing how you're doing. She asks about my patients. She asks about Dara. She asks about the print of Helen and whether the light is right on it in the afternoon. Last Sunday, she said, you know what Helen would have said about you? I said, what? She said, she would have said you turned out exactly right. She said, she would have meant the whole thing, the face and the work and the woman. She said, she was generous that way. I said, she sounds like you. Roslyn said, she was better than me. She said, but I learned from her. She said, that's what the people who love you correctly teach you to do. Here is what I want to say before I go. There is a specific and particular damage that comes from being told, from childhood, that you are the lesser version of your own face. Not that you are ugly. Nobody ever says that. The people who love you are too careful for the word, but that you are fine, acceptable, interesting, the one with the personality. This damage is quiet. It accumulates without drama. It shows up in the way you carry a room, in the things you do not allow yourself to want, in the lane you stay in because you have been told reliably and lovingly that the other lane is not yours. It is not visible damage. It is the kind that lives in how you look at a mirror and what you see when you look. My father did not intend it. This is the specific and frustrating truth of the kind of damage done by people who love you imperfectly. The intention was never to harm. The intention was to manage, to prepare, to help me understand the world as he understood it, a world in which his mother's face was the lesser version, and he had been trained to see it that way for 30 years and had passed the training on to me without knowing he was doing it. The harm was real. The intention was not malicious. Both things are true and both things matter, and neither one makes the other go away. What Roslyn did at that wedding, standing up uninvited, at 73, with a water glass instead of champagne, saying the true thing in front of 63 people because she had decided she was not going to take it to her grave, was not just a correction of a fact. It was the handing over of a primary source. She said, here is the original. Here is what the face you have been told was plain actually looks like when you see it without the training. Here is Helen. Now, you know, I took the photograph. I looked at it for the first time without the training. I said, that's me. It was the first time I had ever looked at my face and seen it accurately. If someone in your life has spent years telling you, in the gentle language of people who love you imperfectly, that your version of the thing is the lesser version, I want you to hear this. They were wrong. They were wrong because of their training, because of their damage, because of the thing they inherited from the person who told it to them. The training does not pass its own accuracy test. It passes from person to person without examination. A fact that has never been checked, a conclusion built on someone else's damage given to you as if it were information about who you are. It is not information about who you are. Find your Roslyn. Find the person in your family who has been watching for 20 years and knows the true version and has been waiting for the right moment. If she has to stand up uninvited at a wedding with a glass of water and say it in front of 63 people, let her say it. Let the room go quiet. Let the right people raise their glasses. The photograph exists. It has always existed. Someone is carrying it in their wallet for you. My name is Lottie Grayson. I am 31 years old. I am an occupational therapist in Asheville, North Carolina. My parents spent 24 years calling me the one with the personality. My great-aunt stood up at my sister's wedding with a glass of water and told 63 people that I had my grandmother's face. My fiancé looked at a photograph and said, "There you are." My grandmother's name was Helen. I have her face. The print of her photograph is to the left of the window in our living room in the afternoon light that Roslyn said was important. She was right about the light. She was right about everything. Thank you for staying until the very end. If someone spent years telling you that your version of yourself was the lesser version, drop a comment. Tell me what they said, and when you found out they were wrong. I read every single one. If this story found you in a moment where you are still inside the damage, share it with the person who is carrying the photograph of you. They have been waiting for the right moment to give it to you. Tell them the moment is now. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.